don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. This episode is a recording of a live discussion that we hosted as part of our ThoughtStretchers education community, which you can find at thoughtstretchers.org. It included Josh Cowen, who is a previous podcast guest and the author of The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers, and Neal McCluskey, who's with the Cato Institute and also an author. That book, most recently and probably most relevant, is called The Fractured Schoolhouse, Reexamining Education for a Free, Equal, and Harmonious Society. We had a number of folks who joined us who RSVP'd at the event page, again, at thoughtstretchers.org. I won't go into too much depth on what we spoke about here, but you can probably imagine a libertarian and the perspective that Neal brings, along with Josh and his work, if you're familiar with him from his book and his social media. The conversation was very cordial and lots of dialogue with a few moments of what might be called fireworks and disagreement, but certainly nothing that would rival cable news and the yelling matches that go on there. You'll also hear me pose some of the questions that guests submitted in the Q&A section of the Google Meet. We'll be posting this in a number of places, and one of those places will be on our ThoughtStretchers community. So those of you who are interested in this topic, it might be a good place for you to continue the conversation with those folks who attended and others who did not. If you're interested in conversations like this and taking part in them, we'll have some others that will be coming up, including one on February 17th, which focuses on developing curriculum for deep thinking, the knowledge revival. And we'll be publishing a podcast here in a few weeks that will include several interesting thinkers, Dylan William, Oliver Caviglioli, Carl Hendrick, and Christian Balkova. And we talked about cognitive load theory in that conversation. And I hope to have and host more kinds of conversations like this that are collaborative and reflective. Some of those will be recorded, some of those will be live where you can RSVP, and we're hoping to have even some ad hoc kinds of salon-style conversations on our ThoughtStretchers community. Again, I encourage you to go to thoughtstretchers.org and continue the conversation there. I'd also like to remind you, of course, to visit our professional development website, which is wegrowteachers.com. All of our professional development and workshops are there, as well as this podcast and blog pieces. And I'd also like to remind you that our PBL Grow 25 event is open for registration and in early bird mode right now. As always, you can reach out to me with any comments, questions, or ideas at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now I hope you enjoy this conversation with Neal McCluskey and Josh Cowen. Hello to everyone. We are on a time schedule because Josh has a 5 a.m. flight. He's a glutton for punishment. And I want to make sure that we are getting him out by roughly 9 o'clock. So this is the ThoughtStretchers Community event, podcast live, school choice, and vouchers. Welcome to that, the good, bad, and the ugly. And I'm going to let you decide who is the ugly. Might be me. And thanks to Josh and Neal for joining us and giving some time and to have the conversation collaboratively. Josh was on the podcast October 30th of 2024. The episode there was the case against school choice vouchers, and that's linked on the event page, of course, if you want to take a look at that or listen to that. And Neal was on just before then, October 10th, and the title of that was A Libertarian Look at School Choice. Of course, I'd definitely suggest and recommend and would love for you all to listen to the ThoughtStretchers podcast. Subscribe if you are so inclined. Visit our ThoughtStretchers Education Professional Development site, which is at wegrowteachers.com. And then, of course, you have been to thoughtstretchers.org, which is our community site, trying to have some of these events and foster a community where we can have some conversation, less about debate and yelling at each other, but more about learning and understanding and using the inquiry process. Again, we're going to try to wrap up as close to 9 as possible. And the format is that I'm going to give these guys an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work and the ways that they think about school choice and vouchers. And I've got a few questions that I'd like to get us going with, and then I'd also invite you to use the Q&A feature, which should allow you to upvote and add questions that I can then use to harvest and ask these guys some questions. And if you have some questions that are specific to either Josh or Neal, please put that in that question format. Anyways, with all of that said, let's get going because we are on a short time frame. So I want to give these guys, like I said, an opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll start with Josh. Josh, if you want to kind of give the folks a little bit of background on who you are. I know you certainly want to mention your recent book, your new book, Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. But there's much more to Josh, I'm sure, that he would like to share. So the floor is yours.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me back on. Neal, nice to see you. Appreciate your time too here as well. Just be brief here. My name is Josh Cowen. I was trained as a policy analyst. Gotten more into some more political and historical arguments as well. But at the end of the day, my bread and butter is asking questions like what works for kids and families. Who do these programs work for? If they don't work for whom, why not? I have done a lot research in a lot of different areas, school vouchers, school choice on the private side and on the charter side. I see a very big difference between those two. Hope we get into some of that tonight. And kind of started my career as a young analyst on voucher programs actually 20 years ago. Fairly optimistic that at least as a policy tool to help kids would have some impact. Early data showed that was true. And then over the last decade or so, results got pretty bad. My own viewpoint on those things changed. And, decided to write a book about kind of why I think that was going on, what the data seemed to say, and why we're still having this conversation, at least on the private school choice side. Looking forward to being here and engaging, and that's what I got for you.
Yeah, and just full disclosure, Josh is a professor at my alma mater, Michigan State University, and my bad scheduling because Michigan State basketball is playing right now as we speak, and my scheduling prowess has me missing that game, but I'll have to catch it on replay. So,
yeah. Sports Center.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Josh. So Neal is with Cato Institute, and he's going to talk about his exact role there. He's an author of more than one book that I'm aware of. The Fractured Schoolhouse is the most recent one, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. Reexamining Education for a Free, Equal, and Harmonious Society. But tell the folks a little bit more about yourself, Neal.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say is I don't have a flight tomorrow and my team's getting killed. So I'm in no hurry to get off this call because I don't want to see the final outcome, and I can stay up and watch TV as long as I want. But other than that, so I'm Neal McCluskey, and thanks, Drew, for putting this together, and for Josh and for everybody tonight. I've been at the Cato Institute for over 20 years now. The Cato Institute, if you're not familiar with it, is a libertarian-oriented think tank in Washington, D.C. We do education policy, obviously, but it kind of covers the gamut of issues. So we've got people who do monetary policy, constitutional law, all sorts of other things. Libertarianism, very basically, is the idea that people, especially people who are able to make informed, reasonable decisions for themselves, or reasoned decisions, should be able to make them, and government shouldn't get involved. It obviously gets lots more complicated than that. I direct the Center for Educational Freedom. I would say that sort of the bread and butter of what we do is school choice, and of course we'll talk about school choice, but that can take a number of forms. We have preferences, or at least I have preferences, from some over the others. But we also do work on early childhood through higher education within our center. I have sort of was forced into a particular interest for a little while in the federal role in education, because when I first got to Cato, the president wanted to know where's all that federal education money going? So actually for a while I did a lot of that. But then I got more and more interested in the effect of the education system and how it's structured on social cohesion and of course on liberty. So a lot of what I do is writing about, how do you have a system that is consistent with a free and equal society. And a lot of that is history. There's certainly some empirical work involved in that. So, but that is kind of our focus because we're a libertarian think tank and we're looking to sort of maximize freedom in society. And that kind of in a nutshell is me and what I do.
Gotcha. Well, thanks, Neal. And Josh, if you can, you did a little bit, but kind of outline, what's your basic stance on school choice? And, many people, I think, would maybe assume that you're anti-school choice, which is not necessarily the case. And full disclosure, I'm an advocate of school choice and exercise that right for my daughters, but I certainly have some criticisms and questions for that. So kind of outline your basic stance on school choice, if you would, and then also, what are some of the things that you think are really sort of problematic or big questions that sort of quote unquote the other side needs to reckon with or should be providing better answers for, I guess?
Sure. So there's a lot packed into that question. So I'll try to at least start with the first and interrupt me if I go on too long and you want to take a pause, we can get to the second. But so my basic view on school choice is fairly similar to what it is on a variety of policy strategies. And it has evolved. So over the last, like I say, 20 years or so, if you had asked me as a younger man, I would have just said, we're going to follow the data, we're going to follow the evidence. I still think that needs to be a guiding principle, particularly when we're talking about taxpayer dollars, whether we're talking about state dollars, local dollars, federal dollars. I do think asking what works and what's fiscally responsible are really important questions. Of course, there is the question of what our values are and what do those values entail. And I'm starting to lean more for folks who follow my writing and some of my social posting much more toward the many of the values conversations, even as I try to ground myself in evidence. But either of those sets of kind of decision rules, whether it's evidence and or values, kind of leads me to acknowledge that there needs to be a role for some forms of school choice in the public sphere. So most states, more than 40 states, have interdistrict open enrollment programs I strongly support. We could talk about some of the rules that I think should be in place for those, but for the most part, interdistrict choices serves a real strong function in my state, for example. Charter schools that have strong transparency requirements, accountability requirements, limits to some extent on the extent to which for-profit industries, especially offshore private equity groups, can make money off vulnerable kids. Those are really important. My state, 85% of charter schools are run by for-profit agencies, and many of those are out of state. And I would like to have better answers to the question, like, what is it that out-of-state private equity, in some cases offshore private equity, sees about Michigan children and sees dollar signs. So those I have some concerns about in the charter side. But listen, I mean, it's not arguable. It's quite clear that particularly nonprofit charters and charters that have really robust transparency and accountability systems in place have done some really good things for kids. And so if you kind of combine all that together, transparency, reasonable, flexible forms of school choice within the public sector, that leads you to supporting, the landscape that I see is important, which is, again, in my state, 1 out of every 4 Michigan kids is using school choice today on a public dime. We don't have vouchers. We don't have publicly funded private tuition, but we do have a lot of options for kids, and I support those. When it comes to the voucher piece, though, this is where I draw the line. And I will say, and I write about this in the book, and I've written about this on social media, like, for a long time in my career, that line was really strictly evidence-based. So I followed. I mean, you can draw a very clear line between the size and the recency of the voucher system and the results for kids, at least the results as measured by academic outcomes. The bigger and the more recent the voucher scheme, the worse the results. It just wasn't true 20 years ago. We didn't have any data on it that showed that were ringing these alarm bells. And then over the last decade or so, a dozen years or so, we started to see some of the worst academic declines in the history of education research as caused by voucher systems in the States. And that's when I started saying, wait a minute, we got a problem here. And I think most folks in the field started to ask that question too. More recently, as kind of we doubled down during the first Trump term onto these schemes, despite the horrific results for kids, that's when I started to talk about some of these other issues that I think are really important, that it isn't, when it comes to publicly funded private schools, it's not school choice, it's the school's choice. The schools are doing the choosing, period. I think that's wrong if we're using taxpayer dollars. And you know, when you go from that angle and you start to talk about how do these things serve kids with disabilities, how do these things serve kids who may be families from divorce and they want to go to a school that says no, you got to have two, you know, married parents, right? Like there's a whole list of things when we're talking about taxpayer dollars I think we start to object to. But at the core, the thing that got me into this space, publicly speaking, was that 3/4 of voucher users in state after state after state are already in private school before taxpayers picked up the dime. And the few who do switch see some of the worst results ever seen in the history of education research. NAEP's about to release tomorrow. I guarantee you the results from the vouchers over the last 10 years are worse than any of the NAEP-related declines we're going to see released tomorrow. And that's what got me started on this. So that's where I draw the line. All options should be available when we're talking about school choice within the public sector, including charter schools. But taxpayer funding for private tuition really is a non-starter, and the results really seem to show that it hurts kids and families.
All right. Well, that's a great opening salvo there. Neal, I'm going to kind of have you respond to the same kind of question, you know, outlining your sort of basic stance on school choice and, you know, what do you think, quote unquote, the other side really should be or needing to be reckoned with at least more effectively. And just to be clear, Josh and Neal, I think there's a significant overlap in the way that they think about school choice. So this is not a diametrical opposition, that kind of thing. So Neal, go ahead.
I hate to disagree with the last thing you said, but we may be about to head into diametrical opposition territory. No, I won't say that exactly. So, I mean, I think that any degree to which we have choice within the public education system or the education system is good. The worst scenario I think we could have, well, it would probably be the federal government makes all education decisions for everyone. The closer we can get to individual families and communities, the better. So, and if we can have choice within the public system, that's better than not having choice within the public system. But fundamentally, what drives me, and I think informs actually a lot of people on the school choice side, and I should say, the school choice support community is in no way monolithic. There are all sorts of people in all sorts of positions who have all sorts of different emphases. For a while, back when, you know, sort of the No Child Left Behind era, a whole lot of people on both sides were saying, look, test scores are what is most important. Historically, though, that's not what's been most important. Most important when you look at our education system has been about imparting values. When you go back to the founding era or people through Horace Mann, it was about imparting virtue first and foremost and shaping citizens. And I think that that is the most important thing to talk about in the education system. And I think the most concerning thing in the education system, which we've seen historically is what public schooling has been about, is to try to homogenize. That's changed, I'd say, in the last 60 years or so. Much more, you know, maybe it was Sputnik, maybe it was A Nation at Risk, but much more on skills acquisition. But virtue, molding kids, what is right, what is wrong, how we deal with those things, to me, is most important. And I think that you have to have a system of private choice where people can choose school with a specific ethos, a particular concentration that is consistent with people's different values and desires and needs. And I think that means you've got to go beyond just choice within the public system. I think religion for those who want it, needs to be a part of the education system. In fact, I think it is unconstitutional discrimination against religion that we require religious people to pay for public schools, which we say can't be religious, and then pay twice for religious schools. So I take this more from a standpoint of what I would call pluralism or diversity and equality, and not so much about academic outcomes and test scores. I will say, though, that a lot of the research that we saw where things got worse for testing outcomes, and I don't disagree that they were worse than the earlier studies, but they were also importantly kind of during the height of No Child Left Behind, when public schools were being very much held accountable by test scores or for test scores, and private schools weren't. And what we were starting to do is say, well, private schools, now you're going to be put into this mold more. And I think to some extent, we shouldn't have been surprised if they didn't do as well on test scores. And I worry about a system that focuses on, well, what do the tests tell us? Because we think, we've had some international results come out in the last few months, and we say, well, why is China doing better than we are? And when you look into China, if you see the sort of system they have, it is all about the test. And it's all about testing because for thousands of years, the key way to become upwardly mobile was succeed on government tests to get jobs in the bureaucracy, in the government. And they have problems with creative thinking. They have troubles with entrepreneurship. And it may be that the education system is reflection of deeper culture. But I think we want to be very careful about making academic outcomes as measured by standardized tests, the ultimate measure of whether or not our education system is working or whether or not school choice is working. We should certainly have that information available for people. And most school choice programs, and I meant to go through the spectrum of school choice and forgot, which I could do if somebody wants. But most of them, depending on what they are, have some testing requirement. It may not be the state test because we don't want to homogenize school, but it could be a requirement of a national norm reference test or something like that, because we want parents to have the information, but we don't want to impose uniformity on something that is supposed to be different so we can meet the needs of a diverse, plural society, as well as capture or have the ability to try different things that you need in order to constantly improve, in order to have innovation in the education system, which I think is also important.
So, Neal, I'm going to ask you if you would to respond to this, and I know Josh has some distinctions to make on what vouchers are and how you feel about vouchers. I think, if I'm remembering correctly from our podcast discussion, you were more, I think, in favor of, was it ESAs or something like that? But if you can sort of clarify how you think about vouchers, and then I'll ask Josh to do the same kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'll just give a sort of my spectrum of private school choice. I have kind of a spectrum of all choice, but that's probably going too far. But the vouchers are what most people think of, and this is kind of the first of the modern school choice programs. We had town tuitioning. We had other school choice before that in some places, but people think of this as kind of the basic Milton Friedman idea of government may fund education, but instead of the money going directly to public schools to which you were assigned based on your home address, they sort of are attached to the student like a backpack, as people like to say, and then they can take it to whatever school they want. And as a basic concept, I'm okay with vouchers. What we've seen become much more popular in the last 10 years or so are education savings accounts, in which money is put into an account in the name of a student, and you can use it for tuition if you want at a private school, kind of like you could use vouchers. But you could also use it to buy curricular equipment. You could use it to buy tutoring, lots of different things. The idea is that parents can customize education. And I think that's okay. I think that's better than vouchers. What I prefer, though, are tax credits and there are different kinds of tax credits. So you can understand a tax credit where you get a tax credit. If you pay for a private school, then you get a credit on your taxes for some amount of what that is. But there's a sort of a more powerful donation credit where if you donate to groups that put together vouchers or scholarships for kids, you get a donation. So low-income families who may not have a big enough state tax burden to cover their costs. They benefit from other people being able to choose to donate to scholarship granting organizations. The reason I think that's preferable, first and foremost, is it means freedom, not just more freedom for the families, but also for funders. I do think there's a problem with vouchers where we say you have to pay your taxes, and that money can go to somebody who could send their child to a school that teaches things you think are abhorrent, or may just not teach math well, or something like that. With donation credits, you have more control over what sorts of schools those scholarships can be used at. And then there's the idea of tax credit funded or connected education savings accounts, which is basically the same idea, except you say, I'm going to give money that then gets bundled into savings accounts that can be used for all sorts of things. But in theory, you could say, I only want it to go to students who would be able to use it for X, Y, or Z. And again, the goal there is to maximize freedom, not just for the families, the people who get it, but also for funders, not make it something that you're compelled to do, but something you choose to do.
All right. Thank you. Josh, kind of your rundown on what you think about vouchers and any response to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's largely right. Don't necessarily disagree with some of those broad strokes. I'd say at the end of the day, though, a voucher is a voucher is a voucher. Some of these distinctions are basically it's the difference between driving a Toyota, a Honda, a Ford Escape. They're all going to be sort of different vehicles for the same goal, which is to get you from point A to point B. And point B in this case is publicly funded private tuition. In Idaho, for example, one of the target states, sort of for the voucher lobby right now, there's competing bills. The House has a tax credit system proposed, not unlike what Neal's describing as his preference, and then the Senate has what's called an ESA, as Neal described. And they're debating about this because the goal is vouchers, is publicly funded private tuition. And there's just some sort of debate about the best way to kind of do that from a mechanism standpoint. In no other real realm of public policy do we kind of pretend that all these different vehicles are different things. There's a lot of debate about cost, and there's a lot of debate about what provides more access, what might be better for consumers, as Neal's describing with parents in the tax credit version. But there's no debate about what the policy goal is. And here, the policy goal is publicly funded private tuition. And ESA in particular is, I think, a little deceptive to some extent because it tucked into the ESA as a voucher. All ESAs are vouchers. Not all vouchers are ESAs, and the distinction really does come down to what else those other allowable expenses are beyond tuition. But I'm old enough to remember. I think we all are old enough to remember, at least chronologically, when states were paying parents directly with vouchers to avoid, until Zellman v. Simmons Harris and the U.S. Supreme Court said, "Hey, you can do this." States were actually starting to send money directly to parents. So, the distinction of sort of plausibly sending money to parents first is not particularly innovative. And the idea there is that they didn't want to directly fund private schools. Again, there's been some litigation that's clarified. I happen to disagree with it, but the Supreme Court has said for now that it's okay to do that. I think what's important here is to just ask the question, what is the goal that we're trying to accomplish? And if your position is that, publicly funded private tuition is the goal, then all of those options that we're talking about, the ESA version with lots of different sort of bells and whistles, the tax credit version where, in the example Neal was describing, what amounts to, folks pay what they owe in state taxes to a voucher fund that distributes the dollars via public school tuition. Courts have ruled that has the same mathematical impact on state budgets as just directly appropriating the dollars. And so a lot of this just comes down to distinctions without a difference. Let's be adults here. What advocates for these things think they can get through litigation, protect from lawsuits. A lot of the strategy just comes down to that. But I do think that, to the extent that, the tax credit version of what's being described has some more flexible spending components, perhaps because they're being distributed by these middlemen, scholarship granting orgs, voucher distribution orgs. There's certainly some potential truth to that. But again, at the end of the day, I think the real distinction here is, do you support publicly funded private tuition or don't you? And then you kind of go in that direction depending on the answer to that question.
Okay. Neal, I don't know, you looked like maybe you were shuffling in your seat, like you had some thoughts you wanted to add. I do want to make sure that we're honoring some of these questions that are coming in the Q&A thing, but do you have anything you briefly want to respond with?
Yeah, I think it's actually, it's incorrect to say that an ESA and a tax credit and a voucher are all the same thing. It is true that the objective is to enable people to not have to pay twice for the education that they want. And that's basically what it comes down to, and we've talked about this. Really, you go back to the 1840s when Roman Catholics said, hey, we're having to pay taxes for de facto Protestant schools. Can we get funding? Yes, sometimes it was for their own schools, but so they could have choice. But they didn't want to pay taxes for schools they couldn't use or they found objectionable, and then pay again for the schools they want. But I think they are meaningful differences, and I don't think it's some of it. There's no question there's strategy involved. Anytime you do anything with politics and government, there's strategy involved. I'm not going to deny that at all. Every side uses that. Even the people who don't like school choice use political strategy, I'm pretty sure. But as I said, I mean, the tax credit distinction is actually very important. So one of the major objections people have had to vouchers is, you've taken my tax dollars and I don't want it going to this school. The tax credit says, if you want to support school choice, you don't want to pay twice for education, but you want to make sure that your money doesn't go to a school that does something you think is objectionable. The tax credit enables you to do that. That's a real difference, and I think it's a value difference where we do say there needs to be some freedom for the funder as well. And so it sort of, I think, papers over meaningful distinctions between these different ways of delivering school choice. So yes, and the ESA is not just about tuition. We have lots of homeschoolers who would like to be able to put together their own education, who could use an ESA to do it, not by paying tuition, but by buying lots of materials that they think would be beneficial for their kids' education. So again, I think these distinctions are actually pretty important, and they're not just something you could just call voucher.
All right. And Josh, I'll just invite you to briefly respond if you have any thoughts you want to respond with.
I mean, I think we'll just sort of politely disagree on this. I do think that, if you just sort of look at the goals here, I mean, at the end of the day, the objectives I think are pretty clear, and I think the mechanics of how to get there from point A to point B are really different. It's like, but we can move on and get into some questions and stuff like that too.
Okay. Yeah, and we are seeing some questions in the Q&A app. One thing I certainly wanted to get to here is the upcoming Supreme Court case, or cases. I think there's two, if I'm understanding that correctly, and they're both based in Oklahoma. You guys probably know this better than me. But this, of course, is really related to one of the things that I think we talked about in both of our individual podcasts, the sort of separation of church and state and the paying for religious schools and religious instruction and those kinds of things with public dollars. I know both of you have some pretty strong feelings, as do I. Josh, I'll let you kind of start here. What's your sense on this Supreme Court case and some of the important things that you think we'll need to consider?
So just to summarize, the issue with the court is whether or not charter school operators can include religious organizations. In this case, the Catholic Church. I'm a Catholic. Don't think my view is very simple. My faith tradition should not be running schools for the government, and no one else's should either. Government-run schools should not be religious providers, either charter schools or public schools. As I said earlier in the conversation, I support many different forms of charter schools, draw the line at a lot of the offshore private equities, but I really draw the line at those that are run by churches. And I just, I don't know what to expect at the Supreme Court. I hope they correctly rule that government shouldn't be running religious schools.
All right, and Neal, and I know you have what I think is a unique stance on this, or maybe it's just not unique in libertarian circles, is that sort of limits on choice actually create conflict and cause a problem in terms of this sort of religion, church, and state issue. But I'll let you tell your story better.
Yeah, well, so the charter case is a tough one. So the crux of the case is, well, anybody basically can be granted a charter. I mean, there are lots of ways that you can not get one, but there's a blanket prohibition on religious chartering. And there's totally understandable why that is, because charters are public schools, and we certainly don't want religious public schools. But the legal argument is, but it is clear discrimination against religion if we say, well, anybody could have a charter, at least in theory, except if you are religious. And again, this goes back to something that has been a problem in public schooling in particular from the beginning. How do you handle and accommodate people with lots of different religious preferences, from no religion to all sorts of different, religions, Christian denominations, the full gamut. And so I'm a little bit torn on this case. I am sympathetic to the concern about discrimination against religion. I think it's clear, just as I think it's clear in public schooling that we discriminate against religion. However, since a charter school is a public school, and because essentially a government entity of some type decides which potential schools can get a charter and which can't, I see very dangerous entanglement of government with religion in chartering. And I can very easily imagine the first time somebody proposes a religious charter of some type and it gets denied, someone will say it was denied because it's religious and that's bias against religion. So I worry about that entanglement. I'm not a lawyer, but I read a lot about law stuff. And apparently the old Lemon test, which talked about entanglement, is sort of fallen apart. So you would have thought at one point, well, it seems like entanglement, so we apply the Lemon test and the court will rule against this school. But apparently Lemon is no longer functional. And so you can imagine the court saying, no, this is discrimination against religion. We're not worried about entanglement, so this school is okay. But my feeling is that it is probably not constitutional because of the entanglement, because we shouldn't have religious public schools. But this points to, again, the necessity of private school choice, in which we say the money follows the students. The government doesn't choose whether or not the schools can exist. And then individual families decide, do I want religion? What religion is it? Rather than government deciding, well, okay, this school's all right, this one's not okay. That's, I think, the only way we can balance religious freedom with public education. Public education meaning publicly funded, but not necessarily provided by government.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the questions here, and again, you can upvote and tell me which ones you think are maybe the most important here. Vince, who's I know from West Michigan, has a question for Josh, and Josh, feel free to also respond to anything there that Neal said in this time as well, but help us understand those performance results from vouchers. Are the declines at the private schools or at the public schools that kids have left?
So two groups of kids use vouchers. They're the kids who are already in private schools, or who would have gone to private schools regardless. Call them the always takers in the sort of policy analysis community. They're going to take what the policy tool, whether it's provided for them or not. And then there are the folks who switch. In this case, the kids who switch from public to private school. 3/4 of voucher users already in private school. And we can debate about whether or not that's, they should, if I understand Neal's position correctly, that's okay because they should be subsidized. They shouldn't, in his words, double pay, disagree with that, but that's at least sort of level setting. 3/4 of voucher users are already in private school. And then there's about 1/4 that do switch from public to private. We know a lot about what happens to those kids because in the old days, the 90s, the 2000s, really up until the start of COVID, most of the voucher bills included pretty robust transparency requirements, on par with or just a tick under what public schools had to do under Nocella Pine and its successor bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And in those evaluations, what we saw is that kids who transferred from public to private, we don't know what happens to the outcomes for kids who are always private because we don't have a before and after. But for the quarter or so of kids using vouchers who did come from public schools, we have a lot of information. And we know that their test scores declined precipitously when they took the voucher, and that those declines lasted for years and years, not just in year one, but years and years. Now, most of those kids historically, up until the COVID-19 pandemic, were some order of magnitude sort of between middle income families and lower. So they weren't necessarily wealthy because these were income tested programs, income capped programs. So my concern, and this actually, to be honest, what got me sort of interested or at least optimistic in the idea of vouchers 20 years ago was I think all things should be on the table within limits guided by our values, as I tried to explain my own set here today. But like, I think when we're talking about vulnerable families and at-risk families, we should be really opening a lot of doors and trying to figure out what we can do to help kids and families. And for a time, for me, that included vouchers, but not anymore. And the reason is, and I've called in many spaces vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending. And the reason is that you get a lot of marketing around these things as hope, opportunity, and you know, I'm with Neal to the extent that I don't think test scores should measure everything. But the reality is, it is precisely test scores that are used to smack public schools around on reading, on math. Again, we're going to get NAEP tomorrow. We're going to be treated with all kinds of stories about how bad public schools are on NAEP, and China's beating us in these schools. Okay, if test scores are good enough to measure public schools, they're good enough to measure publicly funded private schools. It's just really that simple from my perspective. And that's just good stewardship of dollars that belong to taxpayers. And so by those measures, if we're going to say we need vouchers because public schools are not teaching kids to read, and this was the entire theory of the case that came out of Cleveland that became Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, for example. There's this crisis in Cleveland. Well, okay, let's look and see how those kids do when they leave public to private schools. Turns out, if you call it a frying pan, they're definitely going into the fire. And we're talking about, again, some of the largest, this isn't just, the needle didn't move very much. Some of the largest declines we've ever seen in the history of education research for those vulnerable kids who switch from public to private schools using vouchers. We don't know how the wealthy families will do because, frankly, there's a lot of good elite private schools out there. They want no part of vouchers, or at least historically they haven't. The voucher schools in the past that have taken these things have been what I call subprime providers. They're under-enrolled. Well, they're under-enrolled because they're not any good, or they're pop-up schools that flood the market. They're open for 2 or 3 years and they close. And the results show for all this. So just from my perspective, we could have an entire another hour on whether we should use test scores to evaluate schools. I'm not so sure we should. But if we're going to use them to evaluate public schools, then de facto, listen, the average private school taking vouchers is 85 to 95% funded by vouchers. It's not like 10% here, 15% there. These private schools become almost entirely vendors with state governments providing educational services. So if they're going to do that, if they're going to become fully enrolled or nearly fully enrolled on the taxpayer dime, we need to ask how those kids are performing, particularly when we're talking about vulnerable kids and families.
Okay, Neal, I want to actually read a question here from Mary, and I think maybe you may want to respond to some of the things that Josh said there. Mary's got a multi-part question here, but let me read it here. As you mentioned, when we look at evidence-based data, many charter and voucher schools are not meeting the standards. The program has shifted dramatically toward for-profit schools. However, we're so far down this road that public schools are failing because so much funding has been pulled from them to support voucher programs. This leaves parents with a false choice. How do we return to the original intent? And then she added, for context, I live in Indiana, where we currently have a bill in the House that proposes closing 68 public schools and converting them into charter schools, most of them for profit. 50 of these schools are in Indianapolis alone. Hopefully I got the sort of spirit of that correctly. And Mary, you were, I characterized your question accurately here. So Neal, anything you want to respond to what Josh said in the previous piece, and then respond to what Mary was asking about there?
Yeah, I'm going to try and remember all the things I want to respond to. So I have a lot of notes, and this may be a little scattered. I'm not an expert in Indiana, but what I can say is a lot of people talk about school choice, in particular voucher programs or tax credit programs, as being major drains on funding, and they just aren't. I mean, they're much too small to be major funding drains. We just passed 1.2 million kids in the country who are, using one of these programs. There are over 50 million school-age kids in the United States. So it's very difficult to say that, well, major funding loss is the result of school choice. But if it is, that's because people are choosing to go somewhere else. And if people are choosing to go somewhere else, then the question that you should be asking is, well, why is it they want to go somewhere else? I want to agree with Josh on something, and this is how I will bridge to responding to what he said. I'm at the point now where I kind of dread every time NAEP or TIMS or Pearls or PISA or one of these tests comes out, because I do think there are people, so I think there's legitimate alarm, because I think a lot of people think, well, these test scores tell us everything there is about education. And I think people don't really know a whole lot about what the tests say. I don't think they know what it means to be defined as proficient or basic or below basic. And there's going to be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. And I try to suggest that sometimes is overstated. Now, I don't know what tomorrow's NAEP will be. I'm hearing that it's going to be quite a drop, and maybe there's going to be reason for great concern. But I do think we need to be careful about how we respond to every 2 years, or depending on the test, when new results come out, because test scores are not the most important thing in education. But I also, again, my focus is not primarily on academic outcomes, especially as measured by test scores, but I do have to say a little bit about the idea that, well, we have seen sort of conclusive evidence that school choice programs lead to massive drops in testing out in academic achievement. The studies that you point at typically are, yes, Louisiana. That's where the big drops were. And as many people point out, there are particular aspects of the Louisiana program that are problematic, especially with the regulations that kept a lot of schools from joining the program. Usually the ones that were either high achieving or, more importantly, wanted to maintain distinctiveness. And one of the problems is the requirement that you give these tests that can be state tests and high stake tests, where then reorients the entire purpose of your school. And I think that that's a problem. I think it's also worth noting that some of the studies that you point at are not random assignment. Some of them are regression discontinuity design, and some of them say quite clearly, well, we're only able to compare some subsets of students. And there are only a few of these studies. So I don't disagree that the more recent studies have found negative outcomes, but I think it overstates it to say we've pretty much proven that school choice doesn't work, especially because I don't think that test scores are the most important outcomes for many people. And because most of these occurred during No Child Left Behind, when public schools in particular were focused on standardized tests. Some would say far too focused, because it was a requirement of the federal government not to get labeled as failing. And that wasn't the case for private schools. And in fact, I think we would kind of not want it to be the case for private schools. One, if we don't think education should be reduced to tests. And two, if we want these to be options that can be truly different. So yes, were there drops? I don't question that. But I think it's an overstatement to say that we've basically got conclusive proof that school choice is bad for academic outcomes.
So if I'm a reader of body language, I think Josh may have some things he may want to respond with in the chat, not the questions here, but I'll preface maybe the time here, Josh, for you to respond with this is Tyler had said people with no children pay property taxes. Those taxes should not follow the child because they are about bettering the quality of the workforce of the state by providing what the state believes to be an adequate education, by allowing school vouchers to go to schools that aren't contributing to that by meeting the standards the state sets. We undermine the value of those tax dollars. So maybe adding a little bit more meat to that bone. And again, if I'm a reader of body language, I think you had some things you want to say.
I guess I would just say, if we're going to, so 2 of the 4 sets of studies showing horrific negative declines were randomized controlled trials. If we're going to throw out anything that's not a randomized controlled trial, we got to throw out all competitive effect studies, which I've acknowledged a handful exist, but none were randomized controlled trials. We got to throw out all civic effect studies. We got to throw out all parent satisfaction studies, which weren't based on anything except parent surveys, usually industry provided. So, I mean, I think the real question is, are we going to just throw out research as an argument for vouchers? And if we are, then I'm probably not the guy to talk to you about. I mean, like, at the end of the day, I do think research should inform public policy. So if the position is that high quality research shouldn't inform public policy, whether it's an RCT or not, then that's a position to take. But listen, as I say in my book, and I've said this elsewhere, like, no one's saying, at least I'm not saying, that the case against vouchers is one-sided, but it is as one-sided as social science gets. I mean, you just don't get, when you get ambiguities like this in the data, you don't get explanations for them. Bigger, more recent, scaled up versus pilot size, all much more negative. It's 100% true that 1,000 persons pilot studies here and there, a handful of schools, 500 to 1,000 kids in 1999 showed some positive things. But the last study to show that vouchers improve student achievement was published in 2002. I know because I was an RA on that study. The last 2 studies to show that vouchers improve student attainment came in 2013, 12 years ago. I know because I'm the lead author on one of those studies. Since then, it's been a disaster. So I think the question is just, are we going to use research to inform this question, or are we not? And if we are, then the question is really, really straightforward. The answer is really, really straightforward. It's as one-sided as evidence gets. And you really got to go to, like, these kind of weird kind of lobby group studies to kind of even get anywhere near approaching mixed results on that. As far as the fiscal impact stuff and the funding piece, I think that's actually where most of this conversation, both here tonight and in the sort of the national dialogue right now, it's a conversation about dollars. It's a conversation about, okay, do these small programs right now that expand in Ohio and Florida and Arizona well past $1 billion? Fiscal note in Texas is well past $1 billion. We're going to be past $1 billion if Tennessee, in 4 years, if Tennessee passes their bill. I mean, these programs are growing by design. And so I think there's a political problem on the other side from me on this question, because they know that there's deep support for publicly funded schools, for especially in rural communities. And there's deep opposition to defunding, or threatening even to defund public schools. And so they're sort of trying to kind of have it both ways. They're sort of saying, we need more choice, but you can have everything. You don't have to pay for it. We won't threaten the public schools with funding. You know, those competitive effect studies I mentioned, those handful of decent studies, and there's a bunch of not decent studies and a handful of pretty good ones that do show that there are tiny impacts in Florida for introducing a voucher system into at-risk districts, and you do see some public schools ticking upward on that standardized test. But you know where those effects are located? They're in schools threatened with funding loss. And so you can't really have it both ways. It's like either vouchers threaten public funding for schools, or they don't. And that's, I think, where this debate is turning, again, in this conversation, but also just nationally. Because I think we're all kind of tired about talking about test scores. Listen, if evidence meant anything, vouchers would have died 8 years ago, because it's that bad. So now we're just talking about, like, what's the right way to steward public dollars for community resources? And I think that's where this conversation is being had all over the country right now, both in legislators, chat rooms like this, coffee shops, and community roundtables. I think this is where we're really having to dial down and get serious.
Sure. I just want to say, if anybody heard me say throw out research, you are mishearing. What I'm saying is you've overstated what the research says, and you have just, I think, done it again. Yes, there are some studies out there. No, I don't expect them to be all random controlled trial studies. But you're saying, well, you just wait, please. Hold on one second.
Come on.
Look at your own list. Your own list, you point to, I think it's 2 studies from Louisiana, 1 from Indiana, 1 from Ohio. You have if I recall, something from CAP sort of summarizing these. To say that is an open and closed case in terms of research on school choice is just, I think, completely overstating what you can draw from that research. And I'm not disagreeing.
Stuff from 1995 Sure, but you can't find anything from the last dozen years, and that should inform this question. Far more children have been hurt academically by voucher schemes than have ever been helped. That's the research consensus. I mean,
research consensus. You pick some studies and say, now it's closed. If you actually think that we should value research, we don't say, well, it's closed now, especially because the studies that you have, many of them are, I don't want perfection, but we should acknowledge the limits. And one, for instance, says, well, we could only compare basically the best of the students, or from the best schools that were qualified for choice versus the kids who got choice. And that's a real limit. So I think that it's just wrong to say that, well, we know that the research proves that school choice hurts kids. And I do think that if we're going to say, well, we don't need to have perfect research on test scores, then you'd say the same for all sorts of the other outcomes, the completion outcomes, the parent satisfaction. All those things are imperfect, but we can't just throw them out. The civic outcomes, those competitive effects. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that you can't say we have closed the door on research for school choice because we've proven it doesn't work. And of course, because we also don't accept the test scores are the end all and be all of what education's about.
So we've got about 5 minutes left here, and I think this question here that David has posed is maybe tangentially related there. And to be fair, I think, Neal, I think Josh was saying vouchers, not school choice, and I'll let you respond here. But David, the question, could Josh describe the process of how he would unwind existing choice programs? And you may take exception with exactly that language, but there are thousands of families years on these programs they often financially rely on. How would Josh want to use compulsory education laws to assimilate those families into schools they don't want to be in? Yeah.
I don't think we should celebrate school closures, and I don't think we should celebrate students having to transfer against their will. I wouldn't support any policy initiative that required private school or publicly funded private school or publicly funded charter schools or whatever else kids to have to transfer out of these programs. I think these should be sunsetted over time, not taking new applicants, or folks can use philanthropy or other funding. Again, 3/4 of voucher users are already in private school to begin with, so let's not pretend that there aren't other resources for these families. But for those few who did switch and do switch, programs stay open. This is pretty normal stuff. But listen, I mean, talk about like when Illinois sunsetted its voucher tax credit last year. You saw the Archdiocese again. I'm born and baptized Catholic. My confirmation name was Vincent. I am real. This is not a Catholic argument per se, but my church went out there and created a whole litany of marketing around kids having to leave the program, which was not happening, by the way. But what was happening and what does happen is, again, when it comes to these voucher schemes, it's the school's choice. It's not school choice for kids and families. And that includes not just on the front, not just on the admission, but on throwing kids out. So while the Archdiocese of Chicago was going around saying that voucher opponents were throwing kids out of schools, they were doing that themselves for any number of reasons. What they call discipline. Kids perhaps having a pregnancy in high school, not aligning with the school's faith tradition, perhaps. So like this kind of stuff happens all the time. I don't support public policy yanking the rug out of families, whether it's a voucher system or a charter or anything else. If the kids are in the school, they should be able to go and graduate, or if their school throws them out, then that's a different conversation. But we do this all the time in public policy, sunsetting programs, not taking new applicants, and that's the reasonable approach to doing so with existing voucher systems over time.
I want to give you an opportunity, hopefully with a short leash, as we're coming up on 9 o'clock here, to respond, and then we'll do some closing statements and give everybody a farewell adieu.
Yeah, let's first, I do think we need to address this idea that it's the school's choice. We need to understand how a free society works and how pluralism works. If a school wants to have a particular ethos, say it's a Catholic school, and they say, our Catholic school stands for particular values, then it absolutely makes sense that school would say, if you don't support these values, in particular, if you're going to actively undermine them, you are not be accepted into this school. That's actually how you have school choice. You have schools that can be different, that can be consistent. in the things that they stand for that parents might want. That said, I'm familiar enough with a lot of private schools, including Catholic schools, who are happy to get any enrollment. And the reason they're happy to get any enrollment, in part, is because it is extremely difficult to compete against something that is being given away for free. Not just given away for free, but that you paid taxes for. So you're asking families, if you're that Catholic school, hey, pay taxes for your public school, then please pay again, not nearly what we spend in the public school, to come to this school. You don't see many private schools with very high tuition. Yes, there are some elite private schools. And so what we have to understand is, yes, they have to stand for something, but many of them are very, I wouldn't say desperate, but very much in need of paying students. And they have a very strong incentive not to turn students away. Most schools are not Andover and Exeter. Most private schools are small religious schools. Many of them are Catholic schools, which are happy to take non-Catholics. But if we tell a school, you cannot stand for the things you stand for, then we greatly reduce choice, because we say everybody basically has to be the same. And so, saying it's the school's choice ignores that choice has to go both ways. In a free society, both parties get to make decisions, but enabling people to make those decisions makes that choice real. But also, private schools face very real constraints of they have to have income. If they want to continue to survive, they have to have income against an entity that basically gives the product away for free. So they have strong incentives to keep as many students as they can.
So it is 9 o'clock, and I want to honor especially Josh's time, as he has a 5 a.m. Flight, and give both these guys an opportunity to make sort of a closing statement here in a moment. I want to thank both of them and thank all of you for joining. Obviously, a very complex and nuanced issue. Lots more. Some of the comments were that we wish we had another hour, and of course then that would give us impetus to want another hour after that. I would urge you and certainly hope that you would check our websites out. WeGrowTeachers.com is our professional development site, and of course ThoughtStretchers.org, which is our community site. We'll have more of these kinds of events, and feel free to check that out and join. Certainly would invite you to do that, but I want to give Josh and then Neal an opportunity to sort of make any sort of closing statements and share any information or links that you would like to before we get you out of here.
I just say I appreciate you having us, Neal, Drew. Appreciate chatting with you, Neal. I think what it comes down to for me at the end of the day is, we have to be serious about policy reforms that help kids and families. And, by any sort of metric that I am professionally trained in, that the sort of entire research communities are built around, these voucher schemes in particular don't work. Now, does that mean it's the end all be all? Should that be the entire dictate for public policy? No, but it should be a conversation. It should be part of the conversation. But at the end of the day, I think we do have to talk about what good stewardship of public dollars are, whether we're talking about state budgets, which are incredibly important to local communities, as well as sort of the way these treasured states that we have are operating. I think we have to ask ourselves whether it's so important that private entities get the right to handpick students that we're going to kind of risk the futures of vulnerable kids and families by telling them that they get choices when in fact it is those schools. I mean, I think everything Neal just said is theoretically nice and sounds like it's what one wants. Perhaps I would disagree on whether we want those things on the public dime. But listen, my big objection, I think what really got me active in this space, what brought me here to this room tonight, was the specific and explicit marketing specifically to vulnerable kids and families, specifically to kids who maybe weren't perfectly served or aren't perfectly served by the public schools, telling them that this is about hope and opportunity and lifelong economic gains for them and academic superstardom that they can do leaving their community schools. This is just not what has happened in the data. And so, while there are some, I think, nice theoretical and philosophical debates we can have at coffee shops or lecture halls or in forums like this, at the end of the day, when we're talking about kids' futures, we're talking about opportunities for those kids, we're talking about the promises that we make as citizens and the stewardship that we hold over taxpayer dollars, I think we have a responsibility to get this right and to mean what we say and to tell them the truth. And by any of those metrics, public funding for private schools has failed. I stand by that position, and I think you all should watch, because as these things roll out over the next few years, you're going to see these data come in. It's going to be horrific.
All right, Neal, I want to give you the last word and get everybody on their way.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for putting this together. And Josh, it's been fun. I hope you have a high quality alarm so that you're able to get to your plane tomorrow on time. For me, I mean, the first thing I'd say is we are supposed to live in a society that is based on liberty. This is what always comes down first for me. This is the libertarian position. And public schooling is inherently at odds with a free society. And it is inherently often unfair and often unjust to any group that is not in the majority and any group that does not have political power. And we've seen this historically for basically the entire history of public schooling. Catholics, African Americans, we need to empower people to make their own education decisions. That means families, that means educators, and that comes through funding attached to students. Where families make the decisions, educators are free to educate as they think is right. And the way that education happens is those families and educators voluntarily come together. I don't think, even though this is not my primary focus, but I don't think that you can look at the research in its totality and in any way say that we know that school choice is bad use of taxpayer funding, that it is clearly bad income or outcomes, that it is clearly shortchanging kids. If you look at the test score data, and again, test scores are not the end-all and be-all of education, not even close. But even if you look at that, we have very limited research. That research itself has limits, and it has hardly shut the door on the outcomes in school choice. If you look at the competitive effects, if you look at civic outcomes, if you look at lots of other measures, again, imperfect research, but tends to point in the direction of school choice succeeding. So I don't think we can say, well, we're just going to kind of put on our analyst hats and say we know it's failed and we should abandon it. But I actually don't think we will be able to abandon it, because you're going to continue to have things like the charter school case where religious people and other people in our pluralist society say, I cannot accept the education that I'm being forced to pay. I want something different that's consistent with my values. And the Constitution, I think, and courts are going to end up interpreting the Constitution as that's required. And if we don't require that, well, then we can continue to have the sorts of debates we're having in places like Oklahoma, where we say, well, do we require the 10 Commandments be posted in every public school? Do we require that people read from the Bible in every public school? So I think that for numerous reasons, but first and foremost, because liberty is right, we need to have school choice, and that has to be meaningful school choice where money follows kids to the schools, private schools, and other educational arrangements that families choose.
Again, thank you to Neal and Josh, and to all of you for attending and submitting your questions. I'll follow up with all of you with an email when this podcast and the audio definitely will be posted, and maybe we'll get some video clips out there. Again, I urge you to share and join. Feel free to join the ThoughtStretchers.org, the community. Certainly hard to gain traction in a world where Twitter, X, and Blue Sky and all these things where everybody seems to want to argue, but that's not what we're after. So if you feel like that is valuable, we'll post this in there, and maybe you can continue the conversation there, as the comments seem to indicate there may be some hunger for that. So again, Josh and Neal, thank you so much. And with that, thank you all very much.
All right, thanks, fellas. Take care.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.